Hail, hail, and welcome to part 3 of the Celtic History Podcast series, which charts the history of Celtic Football Club from 1887 to the current day. In part 2 of the series, titled Freedom and Liberation, Chris was joined by Harry Brady from the Celtic Underground, who covered the period from 1900 to 1920. They discussed the development of the rivalry with Rangers and how that the most revered of terms, the Old Firm, came to fruition, as well as the conspiracy theories that went with playing in the west of Scotland. They then go on to review the style of Celtic playing kit and how it changed in such a short period of time, resulting in the introduction of the hoops we know and love for the first time in 1903. Chris and Harry exchanged views on the first real domination of Scottish football, with Celtic winning 6 titles in a row, as well as a clean sweep in the 1907-08 season, where the club won every trophy they contested. And we begin to hear some of the legendary names such as Patsy Gallagher, Jimmy McMenemy, and Jimmy Quinn. There's more history surrounding the stadium and the issues faced by the Celtic board as they attempted to keep the club financially stable through some difficult times. Further consideration is made of the social climate that Celtic played through the early 1900s, which leads on to an examination of how the First World War impacted the club and the challenges it faced as a result.
Celtic fans were paranoid. There was a summit called because of the behaviour of Celtic and Rangers fans. There was a Liberal government doing welfare in charge, doing welfare reforms. It was all as it is just now. There was an anti-Celtic story in the Daily Record. Nothing changed. Rangers were never this big Protestant bastion against Celtic at the beginning, but it did start to evolve that these upstart Irish Catholic immigrants were starting to win things, and so they put the exhibition trophy up. We thought, we're having that. Won the revised competition for the Ibrox disaster and kept it ever since.
Appointed secretary-manager in 1897, Willie Maley set about his task with determination and vigour.
It wasn't until 1903 that Celtic adopted what is now the famous green and white tubes, which are synonymous worldwide with our club today.
Chains, or white, is for freedom, and green is for liberation.
In 1907, 1908, they won every single trophy that they entered.
It's the fact that seven Celtic players died in the First World War.
It wasn't just the people affected by the war in Europe. Celtic Park itself was used as a place to recruit for the war effort, and indeed an exhibition of trench warfare even took place inside the stadium.
I used to say to my son that I regretted that, unlike me who managed to get to Lisbon, he probably wouldn't get to a European final. But know what? We both went to Seville.
But the real thing that sticks in my mind is after the final whistle, making our way back out the stadium, and everyone singing down the ramps all the way through the stadium, and you got to the bottom and you could still look up and see the Celtic fans coming down, still singing. It was just a fantastic atmosphere, a great day and a great memory.
Now we join Chris McGuigan for part 3 of a 10-part series, where he will cover the period of 1920 to 1930 with his guest, the green and white writer, Paul Larkin.
All through the 20s we produced some men of great amaze. McGrory, Wilson and McLean, the Thompsons and McStays. When Patsy did a somersault, his feet around the ball, he sang Celtic first and Celtic last and Celtic over all.
Chapter 3. Celtic Football Club, 1920 to 1930. During the first 2 decades of the 20th century, Celtic Football Club emerged as one of the game's preeminent powers. As the popularity of football boomed, the fame of the boys spread far beyond the club's Glasgow home. With a reputation for thrilling attacking play, Celtic had established themselves as one of the most famous names in world football. But plaudits were not the only thing the Parkhead team collected. The Hoops had dominated Scottish football for the best part of 20 years, and they had the silverware to prove it. It was a domination which rankled, The success of a club identified as both Catholic and Irish could not be tolerated by some in a Scotland increasingly poisoned by sectarianism. The Church of Scotland would warn of the menace of the Irish race. Scotland, so the people were told, was overgorged by Irishmen. Against this backdrop, it is little wonder that during the 1920s, a supposedly trivial game became an increasingly tribal one. This was a time of dangerous, hateful rhetoric, with blood-stained repercussions which reached far beyond the football pitch. South of the Clyde, Rangers had been anointed as a club to smash the domination of the Celts. Born simply from a desire to play football, the Ibrox club had long been among the most famed and successful names in the Scottish game. Their rivalry with the boys was always keenly contested and financially rewarding. But to challenge the apparent ascendancy of Celtic, Rangers sold their sport and soul to sectarianism. This polarisation of identity was completed on the pitch by starkly contrasting styles. Celtic were a team renowned for an attacking flair. Rangers were strong, physical, disciplined and supremely fit. Never more so than when Bill Striff took full control of the Ibrox side in 1920. The early years of the decade would see Rangers stake their claim as Scotland's football superpower. A robust and resilient Ibrox team claimed the league championship in both 1920 and 1921. With Kilmarnock and Partick Thistle claiming the Scottish Cup, these were difficult times for the once all-conquering Celtic. A lack of silverware was worrying in itself, but concerns were compounded by the distance the club had trailed Rangers in the Championship. But with Willie Maley in charge, and with established talents like Patsy Gallagher and Joe Cassidy, the Hoops were a side you could never write off. In season 1921-22, Rangers had streaked into an early lead in the title race, but were eventually caught and overhauled by Celtic. The destination of the title would go down to the last game of the season. Celtic travelled to Morton, knowing they had to match Rangers' result at Clyde to seal the championship. A record crowd of 23,500 turned out at Capello for the occasion. On the terraces was to be a tense and often brutal afternoon. Greenock was not immune to sectarianism, and the home fans were well prepared to greet their unwelcome visitors with hostility and violence. With Ireland on the verge of civil war, passions were running high among the Celtic support. Throw a season-defining game into the equation, and trouble seemed inevitable. So it proved. Throughout the first half, skirmishes broke out on the terraces. At half-time, with Morton deservedly leading 1-0, hundreds of supporters from both sides engaged in a running battle across the playing field. Eventually, a degree of order was restored, and after the players helped clear the pitch of bottles, steel rivets and other weapons, the game was able to recommence. The Celts would produce a much improved second half display, and a late Andy McAtee header saw the visitors snatch a dramatic 1-1 draw and a crucial point. With Rangers being held to a goalless tie at Shawfield, the championship was returning to Glasgow's East End. Rangers would regain the league title in emphatic fashion the following season. The Celtic finished outside the top two for the first time since 1911. There was, however, ample consolation in the Scottish Cup, which the Celts lifted after a Joe Cassidy goal gave them a 1-0 final victory over Hibernian. Cassidy's Hampden winner meant he had scored an astonishing 10 of Celtic's 12 goals in the competition that year. Despite this triumph, Celtic continued to struggle in the league, as Striff's Rangers racked up the next two titles. At this time, the Scottish Cup was regarded as an honour of at least an equal prestige to that of the league championship, and in 1925, the famous old trophy provided yet more solace for the Hoops' support. Having already lost twice to their city rivals in the league, Celtic went into their semi-final tie with Rangers as undoubted underdogs. But in front of a 101,000 crowd at Hampden, Rangers were savaged. Celtic stunned the champions as the Ibrox club were thrashed 5-0. It was a remarkable victory, but the final against Dundee would not be a formality. The East Coast Dark Blues dominated the first half, and deservedly led 1-0 at the break. After the interval, Dundee weathered early Celtic pressure, and as the game progressed, looked increasingly comfortable. Then came the most remarkable of breakthroughs. With 73 minutes gone, the ball fell to the feet of the veteran Patsy Gallagher on the edge of a crowded area. The mighty Atom dribbled and swerved his way past several crude challengers, before eventually being grounded just yards from the goal line. Just as it appeared the chance of a shot had passed, Patsy wedged the ball between his boots and somersaulted into the net for the equaliser. Inspired of this moment of utter genius, Celtic pushed on for the winner. With just 3 minutes remaining, a John McFarlane cross was met by the head of a flying Jimmy McGrory, who bulleted the ball home for the winner. This incredible cup triumph was followed in 1925-26 with a recapture of the league title, although hopes of a double were dashed when the boys crashed to a disappointing final defeat to St Mirren. The Scottish Cup would be reclaimed in 1927, where East 5 were defeated 3-1 in the final. That, however, would be Celtic's last major honour of the 1920s.
Celtic first and Celtic last and Celtic over all.
Okay, so welcome to Chapter 3 of the Celtic History Podcast, and I'm absolutely delighted to say joining me this evening is none other than Paul Larkin. How is Mr. Larkin?
Very well, Chris. How are you?
Absolutely brilliant, so I am, Paul. So, Paul, we've got 10 years to talk about tonight. We're going to do 1920 to 1930, and I'm sure some people are listening to this going, well, 1920 to 1930, what the hell happened in 1920 to 1930? Not very much, because we weren't that successful. But when you actually read your history and you find out some of the players that played during 1920 to 1930 and some of the things that were going on at the club, yet again, I think we're in for a fascinating couple of hours.
Yep, there's characters galore.
So we're talking about the Jimmy McGrorys, the John Thompsons, we still had Patsy Gallagher. The list's endless, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing about Celtic. No matter how bad the times are on the park, there's always that wee bit of magic that just comes up, that wee bit of romance that just enlivens and enriches the support, and the 1920s were no different.
So just to get things kicked off, when we look at this decade, we were champions twice, we were Scottish Cup winners 3 times, Glasgow Cup winners 5 times, and Glasgow Charity Cup winners 3 times. So not a huge haul in terms of trophies compared to previous years and future years. But we were still pretty competitive on the pitch, and off the pitch the team again began to develop this thing that we know as Celtic today.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there was no doubt that throughout the decade that the club went a wee bit of decline on the park. The club that we know now, yeah, definitely. I mean, perhaps not so much right now, but maybe in the last 20 odd years of the old board and stuff, you're talking about an era where Tom White, who was Celtic chairman, when the average wage was about £8 a week, wanted to bring it down to £6 a week. He thought it was absolutely ridiculous that players were asking for win bonuses and draw bonuses. So which the players were asking at the time, what, £2 a win and £1 a draw. He thought that's scandalous for a Celtic team. Should never be rewarded for it. They should be expected to win and stuff like that. But also, some of these players, as I said before, when the times weren't as good, some of them were worth the admission money alone to come along and see, and I suppose that, the race throughout Celtic's history, we've always had that, Chris.
You only have to mention James McGrory, and James McGrory signed in 1821 and played right through to 1837. I imagine what it would have been like at the time, Paul, to pay your money at the gate and go and watch Jimmy McGrory.
Well, I mean, Jimmy McGrory, he actually played his first game in 1923. It was against Bob Lanark. I mean, there's been so much documented with Jimmy McGrory and all that kind of thing. I mean, just the magnitude of his impact in world football. A story that I read, which didn't actually happen in the 1920s, but I just thought was absolutely brilliant, just summed up McGrory, is that you always hear about McGrory, he only ever got 7 caps, and he actually scored 6 goals in his 7 caps. But one of the goals was a winning goal against England at Hampden in the last minute that was responsible for what we now know as the Hampden War. That was where the very phrase was coined from, that McGrory winning goal.
In front of 134,000 people.
Yes, which I believe, stood until Celtic broke the record in 1938 and then obviously the European record in 1970. But McGrory, if there was ever an epitome on the field of Celtic Football Club, it was probably Jimmy McGrory. You know, he was Irish Scots, he was a rebel heart for the Gallagher, played for St Roch's. The stories are just magnificent about the man, and you know, if you think about him in the context of the times right now, I mean, you couldn't even put him on the market. He'd be priceless, you know.
The problem with these podcasts and this period of history is it's very difficult to find anybody that even saw Jimmy McGrory play now.
Yeah, that's right.
You know, how do you compare them to the modern players, Paul, you know?
Well, actually, last year when the Celtic Gravestone commemoration, Jimmy McGrory's son was there, and he looked like Jimmy McGrory. You know, he had the broad shoulders and the short neck and all that kind of thing. But I mean, to measure, because it's easy to look back at McGrory's record and think, oh God, he could be the greatest player ever played for Celtic. But the guys at the time who were supporting it didn't have a clue that he was going to go on to, you know, reach such heights as a Celtic player and stuff. But you could tell the devotion he had for him, because Jimmy McGrory, it's widely known now, was the first ever Celtic player to have a fan club. And the people who joined this fan club used to wear their wee badge with Jimmy McGrory's face on it on their lapel and go about the McGrorys and all that everywhere. And that kind of showed you know, just kind of devotion that people had to this guy, you know, because they could see, you know, because it was widely known about McGrory that he could actually header a ball harder than he could kick it. And so, you know, I mean, to the point where Jack Harkness, the great Scottish goalkeeper, and he was a great friend of Jimmy McGrory, actually broke 3 fingers trying to save a McGrory header one time. Now, can you even imagine how hard that must have been?
It's fantastic, isn't it? You know, he must have been the Georgie Samaras of his day.
Oh, well, I mean, it's what I always think as well. Like, this is in an era when football players were men, you know, they were real men, they played on the part. So, just to do that, I mean, of course, McGrory right through had a massive impact on Celtic, right through the 20s and stuff like that. I'm sure we'll come on to the Patsy Gallagher Cup final later, but what Patsy's goal in that game always overshadows is the fact that Jimmy actually scored a last-minute diving header in that game to win the Cup for Celtic.
That's right.
And this was in an era when the Scottish Cup quite a few times saved Celtic's season. And of course there was one significant thing for Jimmy, 2 significant things actually, was in 1926-27 he scored 49 goals, which was the best in Europe in an entire season. In 1928, he turned down a £10,000 transfer to Arsenal, which the Celtic board had basically banked on him doing, and infuriated him so much that they docked his wages. So right away, again, the kind of old board, the Kellys and the Whites, were coming to fruition. But at the start of that year, in 1928, the 14th of January, Jimmy actually scored 8 goals against Dunfermline in one game.
The records are just one after another with the man, like.
Yeah. I mean, you're talking about a guy, Jimmy McGrory, you know, in that season where he scored the 49 goals in Europe, he actually scored 5 different hat-tricks against 5 different teams. He also scored a hat-trick in 3 minutes, which earned him the nickname A Goal a Minute McGrory. And this was in the first 3 minutes of the game, Chris.
Fantastic.
So, I mean, I think even right now, if you were to do that with no players in the opposition, it would be hard to run up, put the ball in the net, run back inside 3 minutes. and Jimmy done that. And of course, this was in an era where the 1920s were the first era where you actually had a recognised centre-half in your team, which was primarily to stop the striker or the centre-forward scoring goals. That's what they were there for. And yet Jimmy was still able to score hat-tricks and 8 goals and, you know, hat-tricks galore, that kind of thing. With a guy trying to stop him playing, you know? So, I mean, you can't even really put any words of the impact Jimmy McGrory had on Celtic, or indeed, you know, has had on the entire history of Celtic Football Club.
And to put it into perspective too, I mean, you weren't talking about the Scottish League as we know it today, where you know it's you know a poor relation to some of the bigger leagues throughout the world. The Scottish League at the time was one of the premier leagues, certainly in Europe and maybe in the world.
Absolutely. I mean, unfortunately, the 1920s were the sort of era where kind of Rangers, Oldco tried to sort of basically put their act together. Mr. Struth took the reins, and you know, was basically where he I would go as far to say enforced the sectarian policy. Indeed, there was a story because Rangers hadn't won the Scottish Cup since 1905, and it was kind of coming like a noose around their neck. They were desperate to win it, and a scout said to Bill Struth, well, there's a guy I know that's just become available, and he's won the Scottish Cup before, and he could be the guy who could go and win us it. And he said, oh great, who is it? And he said, oh, it's Tommy McNally. And Struth just said, oh, that's the end of the conversation then, because it just wasn't going to happen. There was never going to be Catholic signed by Rangers. So you had a strong Rangers team then. You had a strong Airdrieonians team then, believe it or not. And you had a strong Queen's Park team, obviously, strong Raith Rovers team. So as you say, Chris, I mean, there was a lot of great sides. Scotland had a great team at the time, they were on the brink of the Wembley Wizards and stuff like that. So it certainly wasn't any kind of SPL now as we know it,
Good evening, London. This is the 7 o'clock news broadcast. I'm Timothy Stan. Civil war has broken out in Ireland today, and there's 6 months since the Anglo-Irish Treaty of 1921, which segregated the North and South. Resistance is led by Eamon de Valera, who demands a free republic immediately.
With the Great War over, but still a recent memory, peacetime in Glasgow brought more cultural change. While many in the East End of Glasgow would be thinking of their previous home as the Irish War of Independence rumbled on, life continued in their new home. 1921 saw the Black Cat Cinema open on the corner of Dechmont Street and Springfield Road, seating nearly 900 people. Showcasing the latest films, the venue was popular all the way up until 1955, when it was taken over by the BBC and used as a studio. For the next 20 years, the venue was famous for shows such as the White Heather Club and the occasional Crackerjack. Although now a warehouse, it still carries the Black Cat Industrial Unit's name. The Black Cat wasn't alone in 1921 either. The Parkhead Picture Palace also opened in that year on Tollcross Road, remaining there until it was destroyed by fire in 1960. The advancing technology of the 1920s was evident in the game of football too. Until that time, if supporters wanted to know what was going on in a match, they either had to be at the game itself, or they would have to wait for the newspaper reports the following day. But in 1927, the Scottish Cup final was broadcast on the wireless for the first time, and Celtic supporters not at the showpiece final were able to listen to the radio broadcast of Celtic beating East Fife 3-1. 1928 saw more advances at Celtic Park too. The grandstand had stood for 24 years despite its early flaws, but it was finally demolished to make way for a newer, more modern stand. While the stand itself was designed by Duncan and Kerr, the imposing front facade was designed by renowned Glasgow architect Archibald Leach. Leach had previously designed several other football stadium stands, including the main stand at Ibrox, which still stands today as a listed building. The new stand saw the end of the stilts, with the seated area being part of a single split tier. Although smaller than its counterpart across the city, it could still seat 4,800 spectators and cost £35,000. The new stand was opened on August 10th, 1929, as Celtic defeated Hearts 2-1. But by that time, another tragedy had befallen the stadium. After the stand fire in 1904, the pavilion on the north side of the stadium had been repaired. However, in May 1929, another fire would finish the job. Although the alarm was raised quickly by those men who were working on the new south stand at the time, the fire spread quickly and engulfed the pavilion. Like its former companion, the mainly wooden structure could not be saved. Sadly though, it was not the structure itself that was the major loss. Many of the pictures from the first 40 years of the club were stored and displayed within the pavilion. When the building caught fire, it spread so quickly that nothing could be saved. Many of those early pictures were lost forever, including pictures of the first Celtic team, the first Scottish Cup winners, the first League Championship winners, and portraits of the very first committee men. Only one item survived the pavilion fire. From the smouldering remains, a battered safe was pulled. Although evidently damaged by the fall from the top floor of the building and by the fire itself, the contents of the safe were still in good condition. Included in the safe were some of the earliest records of Celtic's charitable contributions. While the evidence of the good deeds on the field may have gone, the evidence of the good deeds off the field survived. Celtic Park's transformation in the 1920s was completed when the original roof of the north enclosure was replaced. Whether related to pavilion fire or the modernisation of the stadium, the new curved roof of the enclosure, almost given the appearance of a farmyard building, quickly saw the nickname of the Hay Shed adopted by the supporters. It would not be the last nickname the enclosure would get.
And it's interesting you say that about Rangers, and this certainly isn't a Rangers podcast by any stretch of the imagination, but we've been talking so far in Chapter 1 and Chapter 2 about the formation of Celtic. And, you know, at the turn of the century, how it all started to change, and this flair team, you know, they like to pass the ball and attack, started to develop. And this decade, more than any, probably highlighted that. However, it was our friends across the city who also developed during this period as well to be what they became too.
Yes. There was, as I say, you mentioned Struth before. I mean, Struth was clearly the kind of linchpin of that policy. The kind of social strife that was going on in Glasgow, there was an expansion in Harland and Wolff docks down at the Clydeside, which, I mean, it can't be kind of overemphasised how much of an impact that had on Rangers in terms of the club they became, the policies they undertook, the songs they would sing, and they really became what they became for right up until 2012, which was basically the enemy Celtic, the rivalry Celtic, the antipathy Celtic, everything that Celtic were, they weren't. And that was what they revelled in that. They really made a big effort to go after the kind of Scottish Protestant middle class supporter. And when I say big effort, I mean they went to every single length to do that. And they used Celtic as a kind of, you know, as the hate figure for these fans to come and pack Ibrox, you know, especially when you had loads of people coming over to the North of Ireland to work in Harland and Wolff and stuff like that. And we know what the kind of employment policies were at the time as well. Where, you know, the old joke used to be, you know, have you got any Catholics working in your eye? That's the guy over there with a brush. Aye. You know? I mean, that was the kind of employment policies. So, as we talk about Celtic becoming this cavalier team with, you know, a huge Irish-Scots support and a big rebel heart and the songs and all that kind of thing, this is definitely when Rangers became the Rangers that we knew up until 2012.
What's fabulous about this period as well, Paul, is when we talk about this team on the pitch, the whole social aspect behind it reflected it too. Because not only had you got the end of the First World War and, you know, the troops coming back and the unemployment rising to levels that Britain had never seen before, but you also had the rise in the Labour Party in Glasgow. And that itself, you know, is reflective since way back in the 1920s to even modern day.
Yeah, because obviously when we talk about a Labour Party, we're talking about a real Labour Party back then, a socialist Labour Party, no the kind of Labour Party that the current generation knows. You know, you had that. There was obviously there was the end of the First World War. There was Lloyd George had made the promise about being a land fit for heroes. That never happened. These were huge austere times, huge unemployment. This was, you know, you had seen the revolution in Russia in 1917, the Bolsheviks. This inspired a lot of revolutions, and it inspired huge ones in Scotland, which would lead to the general strike in 1926. You also had a rise in Scottish nationalism and a kind of, how could I put it, effort to reclaim the language. There was a guy who wrote under the pen name Hugh McDermott. Real name was Christopher Grieve. In 1922, he was speaking about independence. He was a guy from Montrose. He inspired a Scottish literary revival. He wanted to reclaim words. For example, a rainbow was called a watergaw. You know, there was a definite kind of freedomly spirit that was emerging in the 1920s on the backdrop of this horrific austerity, which, as you said before, would lead to the general strike in 1926. And people were striking for a 40-hour week. John McLean, the great socialist, was speaking all over the country. As I said before, they were inspired by the Russian Revolution, which led to huge unrest in the middle of George Square, which I know was touched upon in the last podcast, to the point where they were actually, at the end of that day where there was unrest in George Square, there was actually 6 tanks positioned in the salt market to stop any more. So that's the kind of backdrop of this kind of thing. And Celtic, was playing a huge part in this in terms of they were doing things for people to make them money and all that kind of thing. And they were they lowered the prices at Celtic Park, which was unheard of in football. Football was going through a boom time with the crowd. And Celtic were lowering the prices because they understood the social complexity of the situation and the kind of hardship that people were going through, particularly in Glasgow.
And even to put it into perspective about football, in 1921 there was even a competition called the Glasgow Lord Provost Rent Relief Cup. So the whole social aspect at the time was pretty much falling on its backside.
Yeah, because, as I say, it was in 1926, that was when obviously things came to a head. It got so bad that the opening day Celtic were structured to be at Rugby Park, and the fans could not afford to go. So they walked to 20 miles from Glasgow to Rugby Park to go and watch Celtic. And Celtic, as it had been right from the beginning of its conception, had been the beacon of light for fans. Uh-huh. This wasn't just a football team that you went to support on a Saturday and things like that. This was the thing that was guiding a lot of the fans and guiding a lot of people, and it was giving them some really hope that things could get better. And as we touched on before, the people that were playing for Celtic at the time were entertainers. There was people, like Patsy Gallagher and Jimmy McGrory and Tommy McNally especially. They saw their role as actually going out to entertain the people. Much to the kind of chagrin of the manager who just wanted to win football matches, of course. But Tommy McNally especially was one of the guys who was just like, he famously kicked the referee. And as he kicked the referee turned and saw him and pointed over and said, "You, sir," to the pavilion immediately, to which Tommy replied, "Could you not make it the Empire? I was at the pavilion last week." You had, Patsy Gallagher, who, a fantastic Donegal man, a definite guy who could definitely be a good claim to be the greatest player that Celtic ever had at Celtic Park, just because of how loved he was by the fans. He played 464 games, scored 192 goals as a winger. Which is quite incredible. But, had that gala streak, something of the Charlie Tullies about him, where, he was another one who Willie Maley constantly kind of fought with and stuff, and, was always telling him to do things and that. And the famous story about Gallagher trying to wind Willie Maley up was that at a team hotel the night before a game, Patsy actually dressed up as a chambermaid. And actually said, "Good night, Mr. Maley," as he walked out the door, and Mr. Maley said, "Oh, good night, madam," and walked out and went and got himself a drink, these kind of things were going on. Again, Tommy McNally was getting told by Willie Maley, "You've got to stay at the pub, you've got to stay at the pub," and all that, the fans can't see you in the pub and all that kind of thing. And then Maley finds out that Tommy McNally was seen coming out the pub the Friday night, so on the Saturday morning he pulls him aside and he says, "You were seen coming out the pub at 9:30 last night, is that right?" And Tommy McNally said, "Yes, boss, it is. That's when they shut." But these guys, they were all, Patsy and Tommy McNally and Jimmy McGrory, they were all absolute Celtic through and through. And, they saw themselves as kind of representatives of the support in these horrible times,
And even when Patsy Gallagher left Celtic, it was Willie Maley that announced he was retiring, and Gallagher didn't know anything about it, as the story goes, right?
That's right, 1926. He was basically, announced with deep regret that Patsy Gallagher would be no longer playing football, and Patsy was just like, "What the hell are you talking about?" And went to Falkirk for another 5 years. So, it's just one of the ones where I think it was, if you're familiar with the George Best story, I think there was a lot of that going on with these type of players where their off-field antics would just drive the manager crazy, but when you put them on a pitch, they were absolute geniuses,
We seek him here, we seek him there, never to find is very rare. You can go to any single country in the world and you'll find dedicated followers.
Why are you a Celtic fan?
I'm a Celtic fan. I became a Celtic fan on the 25th of May 1967 at 7 years of age. And bizarrely, I did not watch that game. I was living in Drumchapel where I grew up, and I was sitting on a three-wheeler bike, and my dad, who always used to avoid swearing in front of us, I did hear him swearing in the game, but he never really watched me. He came to the window, the curtains were drawn, and he came to the window and said, "They'd effing done it." And I thought, I don't know, I wasn't all that bothered with football then. That, and my mate's dad organised bloody us all running up and down cheering the Celtic, but then when I went to school, that's when it really hit me. And school was so strict, but if anybody had a picture of Billy McNeil or Jock Stein, they were lifted up and they were just charging around the playground. The teachers were bloody joining in and everything. It was like unbelievable.
Why are you a Celtic supporter?
I was born a Celtic fan. My dad's kind of that way inclined, you know. He's brought up Celtic fan, Catholic Irish background, and born in Glasgow, and it's all I've ever known. Been always a Celtic fan. Listened to my dad. He showed me the right way, and that's how it's going. And thank goodness for that, you know. Hail, hail.
Favourite trophy that the Celtic I've won in my time being a fan is probably the Scottish Cup in 94-95 with Tommy Burns being the man in charge at the time. We had went a wee wait for silverware, you know, and it was, I don't know, you know, it was tense times, but tough times being a Celtic fan back then, but I always remember the goal. I'll probably take the visions of the goal to my grave. You know, it was a tense game against Airdrie, and Tosh McKinley picks up the ball and he delivers the sweetest cross you'll ever likely to see, and Big Pierre popped up and done the rest, and you know, the trophy ended up back at Celtic Park.
It's very rare. You can go to any single country in the world and you'll find dedicated followers of Celtic. Yes, you'll find dedicated followers of Celtic. Yeah, you'll find dedicated followers of Celtic.
The characters then must have been absolutely magnificent. As you say, they were entertainers, weren't they?
Oh, definitely.
And that vein goes right through Celtic's history, you know, when you get up and you talk about the Tullys and guys that got there. Just the whole way through their history, there are these larger-than-life characters.
Well, I mean, you know, see, some people who might listen to this and think, oh, God, Tommy McNally must have been a nightmare. There's a couple of stats that you have to know about Tommy McNally. The first one is, in his first season in 1919-1920, as an 18-year-old guy, he scored 39 goals. The second season, he scored 43 goals. So, you know, you kind of give guys like that a wee bit leeway, don't you? He was also the first guy ever that sat on the ball at Ibrox. You know, as far as I'm concerned, he's a legend no matter what.
Absolutely.
He would sit in the ball at Ibrox and, you know, they just beckon the opposition onto him because he knew the fans loved it and all that. And of course, you have to remember as well that, you know, these were hugely divisive times still in Glasgow and surrounding areas, and you know, Celtic were treated pretty shoddily, and Celtic supporters and people with kind of Irish origin and stuff were treated pretty shoddily. And certainly the war of independence in Ireland had begun doing well with, let's just say, the vast majority in Scotland and things like that. Uh-huh. And so when these guys were on, they understood that, you know. When Jimmy McGrory was often quoted saying that he represented the Irish in Glasgow, you know. And you can imagine the kind of, you know, the times that you were in and the austerity you were going through, have somebody saying that for you, it was just incredible, you know.
Well, when you look at the War of Independence in Ireland, and Belfast Celtic pulled out of the league during those years, did Glasgow Celtic feel the same pressure at that time, Paul?
I think there may have been pressure applied, but the amount of people that were going through the turnstiles at Celtic Park and at Celtic games were absolutely enormous. You know, you're talking crowds. You know, Celtic. We talked earlier about the Patsy Gallagher Cup final, and we're sure we'll go into it again. The semi-final that year, 23rd of March 1925, was a game against Rangers. 101,000 people turned up for that game, and Celtic won the game 5-0, which was again one of the ones never expected. Much like the 7-1 game, just came out of nowhere. Another one where people who weren't at the game wouldn't believe the score. Jimmy McGrory scored a hat-trick that day. You know, people were dancing on the terraces. They couldn't believe what they were seeing. So, with all due respect to Belfast Celtic, Celtic was just becoming this huge phenomenon in terms of the games. You know, was quite easily the biggest supported club in Britain. You know, had been for 20-odd years, you know. And because, as I say, the both had the foresight to actually lower the prices, and the lowering of the prices kept the crowds high at Celtic Park. And probably at that point, there was nobody really in the establishment that had the kind of power or the will to actually go and kind of try and destroy Celtic on the basis that, let's not forget, Rangers were building their identity on the basis of being everything that Celtic won there.
So to put that into perspective to everybody listening to this right now, next year when we get Barcelona in the Champions League and we do a fantastic Green Brigade display around the stadium, just think that's about half the number of people that we're talking about here in the 1920s.
Yeah, I mean, it is absolutely. And, you know, I'm sure touch on this, but it's easy. It's easy to say, oh, well, there was nothing for anybody else today. That wasn't true, because this was the age of television starting. This was the age of talkie movies, you know. So there was other things. You know, these were the basic forms of social media. You know, so there were other outlets for people to go and spend their money, but the fans stuck by the club through thick and thin, and this is when there was a real bond that went between the fans. Because, let's don't forget, I mean, you had the First World War had only ended in 1918. There were 800,000 people for Britain lost their lives. You know, so there was a huge kind of desire to go and get something positive, and for many people in Scotland, Celtic was that positive thing.
And it was during this decade that a lot of the sectarian strife started in Glasgow. You know, we've heard about the nickname the Tim Malloys being a local Glasgow gang, and that's where the nickname came from. But that is very much true in and around the Gorbals and Govan and places like that. It was Glasgow at that time, through the poverty and the problems coming back from the war and the unemployment, started to develop a very serious social culture. Yes.
I mean, you often get said in modern times that, you know, oh God, it's terrible now, these kids are running riot and all that. I mean, compared to times like the 20s, it's like paradise now. It really is. You know, there was people getting stabbed and, you know, slashed in pubs almost on a nightly basis. You know, gangs were being formed. Primarily, a lot of it was out of defence. You know, because there was these huge gangs that were running to the city, having massive fights and all that. Because as you say, I mean, the poverty was so high, the sectarianism was being pumped in to Scottish society to basically make money for certain people, you know. There was a kind of thing going around about, you know, Celtic kind of cartoons and newspapers and stuff like that. Celtic supporters were being demonised in these things, you know, and there would often be cartoons of Celtic and Rangers fans, and the Celtic the Rangers fan was always kind of portrayed as somebody who was good looking and lucid and intelligent, and the Celtic fan was always portrayed as like somebody that just walked out of a bog or something. You know, this was the kind of, and so a lot of that, you know, bearing in mind the kind of grip the media had over people in these times, you know, a lot of that would be transformed into, you know, during the week fights, weekend fights, and pubs and dance halls and all that kind of thing. And there was an incredible amount of violence, and a lot of it now, as you said, was being fueled by sectarianism.
And even while all this was going on, this new phenomena of football was probably bigger than it had been since the inception of the Football League and stuff. I mean, we're talking about the build-up in the 20s to the 1930 World Cup, the first ever World Cup, and still we had players like Jimmy McGrory, who got 7 caps and scored 6 goals. The talent that was on the pitch even then was so good, yet we find history repeats itself in later years when you compare these teams to the Lions, where they didn't get the caps and the respect that they deserved as well. And we talked about it in the first 2 chapters as well, about how history repeats.
Yeah, I mean, the context I think you have to put the first part in about the crowds is that in 1921, for example, there was mass immigration to Scotland. You know, people were sick of the kind of austerity, and they were sick of not being able to work and that. A lot of Scottish people went to Canada, they went to other places in the British colonies and stuff like that, because Britain still had some sense of an empire then and things like that. So there was 50,000 people left Scotland in 1921, which, you know, Scotland never been a big population, and yet these football grounds and were getting filled all over the country. Huge people. In terms of McGrory and the caps, I mean, you know, he's always the one you look at, 7 caps, you just think, my God, you know, the top scorer ever in British football history. And at the time, one of the things that was said was, well, Hughie Gallagher's who he's up against, and he's a great player. No, I mean, come on, you know, it doesn't bear up, particularly when, you know, in these 7 caps, as I said before, he scored 6 goals. So at what point, as the selectors, you go, well, did he not score a goal in a game, so they dropped him forever? You know, I mean, it just doesn't add up at all. I mean, clearly there was, definite bias in there, because I'd love to, and then as you say, the unfortunate thing is now that we're so far away from it, you'll never ever hear it, but I'd love to hear somebody actually give me a concise explanation as to why Jimmy McGrory wasn't picked for Scotland, when quite clearly he was the best forward that Scotland ever produced.
That's just your paranoia coming through, Paul.
I know, it's terrible. I'm glad it's Friday of it.
He sang Celtic first and Celtic last and Celtic over all.
Despite some remarkable moments of glory for the Hoops, there was no doubt that Rangers had now usurped the Parkhead side from the pinnacle of Scottish football. Manager Maley was still able to uncover incredible talent from the junior ranks, but it appeared that the ambition which had fueled Celtic's rapid rise to the top was now somewhat lacking. But there remained enough talent in the Hoops to give the Celtic support hope of a return to the top, and no one inspired hope quite as much as the extraordinary James Edward McGrory. Born in the Glasgow Irish enclave of the Gorngard in 1904, McGrory would rewrite the football record books with his unbelievable scoring feats for the club, which he loved with all his heart. Signed in June 1921, Jimmy McGrory was a powerful, barrel-chested forward, prepared to take whatever knocks came his way in search of a goal. Modest and humble off the pitch, McGrory's commitment to the Celtic cause was obvious every time he took to the field. By the summer of 1928, he had become football's most wanted. But despite the club's scandalous attempts to sell him, McGrory turned down an offer from Arsenal to become the highest paid footballer in Britain. His reasoning was simple. McGrory of Arsenal just never sounded as good as McGrory of Celtic. So Robert Kelly later said of McGrory, "No one ever played harder so often for Celtic." Yet, in a disgraceful act that defies reason, the board rewarded this heroic servant by secretly paying him less than his teammates who remained in 9 seasons at Parkhead. In that gracious and dignified manner, which was McGrory's trademark, he said of his foul injustice, "Sure it was worth it, just to put on that hoop jersey so many times." Of course, the magnificent McGrory was not the only Celt to make his mark during this decade. Quiet man Jimmy McStay signed for the boys in November 1920 from the Royal Scots Fusiliers. The younger brother of Hoops hero Willie, Jimmy would take time to settle at Parkhead before establishing himself as an accomplished and effective centre-half. In contrast to the quiet ways of McStay and McGrory, Tommy McNally was a brash and brilliant entertainer. He signed for the boys in May 1919 from junior outfit St Anthony's. A player of immense talent, McNally's showmanship and light-hearted antics delighted the Parkhead crowds, if not Celtic boss Willie Maley. With an eye for goal, superb ball control, vision, great speed and flair in abundance, McNally should have been a manager's dream. but his showboating antics could frustrate and enrage teammates and coaches just as much as they could entertain the crowd. A massive fan's favourite, Tommy McNally, had played 213 times for Celtic during 2 spells at the club. Peter McGonigal was a big-hearted and courageous performer. The strong tackling McGonigal joined Celtic from Dundalk Hibernian in 1926 as a left half, but went on to establish himself as one of the very best fullbacks in the game. Signed in 1922, Alec Thompson was a gifted inside forward who provided Celtic with vision and guile. Seen as a natural successor to the great Jimmy McMenemy, Thompson was a clever craftsman who had the vision and ability to thread intelligent passes through the tightest of defences. The Fifer would go on to be one of the most faithful of Celts, playing a total of 451 games. Cool-headed Peter Wilson was a talented right half who spent 11 seasons as a Celt. The Ayrshire-born player signed for the boys in May 1923. An exquisite pass with the ball, Wilson was a calm and calculated player who would survey his surroundings before setting up a Celtic attack with another inch-perfect pass. As the 1920s stuttered to a disappointing conclusion, perhaps one man more than any gave the Celts hope for the future. That was young keeper John Thompson. The Fifer signed for Celtic in 1926 for a fee of £10. A quiet and unassuming character off the park, Thompson had a natural athleticism aligned to a brave spirit that impressed all who had the privilege to see him play. Thompson's wondrous agility and fearlessness ensured that despite his youth, he was quickly recognised as one of the greatest keepers in the game. As Celtic fans looked forward to the 1930s, the youthful presence of Thompson inspired real confidence in the future for the Parkhead club. As the new decade dawned, no one could have foreseen the heartbreak and tragedy that was to follow.
The other thing that I wanted to talk about on this chapter is how Celtic started to change away from being the Irish Catholic club to probably the more left-wing socialist club.
Yeah.
Is it right to use the word socialist in this context?
Yeah, I think so, because I think that the moving away for the Catholic Church had already began before the 20s. You know, when people seen how much money would be involved with the club and the crowds that they were getting and stuff, and business types were kind of moving in. I mean, it's just the same old story the world over. But there was a clear sense of socialism building in Scotland, and particularly in Glasgow. And I mentioned John McLean before. You know, you've obviously had the War of Independence in Ireland, you'd had the 1916 rebellion, and these were things that played huge parts in the life of Celtic supporters, because let's not forget that, you know, it wasn't that long where generations of Irish people had come over to Glasgow, you know, and that eventually saw the poverty and the strife that ended up with Celtic being formed. But in the 20s, there was definitely a politicisation of the club, and there were strands coming out for all these different things that would play huge parts in Celtic's history. For example, you talk about the War of Independence in Ireland. So obviously Eamon de Valera becomes the president of Ireland after that. And of course, Eamon de Valera was only saved from the kind of gallows or the shooting party in Ireland in 1916 because his actual nationality, he wasn't actually born in Ireland. But he becomes the president of Ireland, and he ends up being the guy who sends over the flag to Jimmy McGrory, who requested it from him. It's the new Irish tricolour at Celtic Park, which the SFA tried to take down. So, you know, even as the strands for that independence, the War of Independence, and then McGrory ended up becoming the manager after being a player at Celtic, the importance of the Irish kind of identity of the club was always strong, but it was a definite political agenda with the club. But the club understood the issues that were surrounding the people. You know, you mentioned playing in a cup that was to help with rent. The fact that they were bringing down the prices. You know, the fact that they were continually, Willie Maley was continually making statements about the social strife around Glasgow, the things that the supporters have to face, the challenges that football have to meet in terms of recognising that, these austere times and all that kind of thing. And then the general strike, which led to, abject poverty, bearing in mind that the Wall Street crash was on its way and stuff like that. But Celtic was very much at the forefront of kind of saying to the supporters, we understand what you're going through and we will act accordingly. And, when you actually think about that, you think about that in terms of modern football right now, where, a chairman or a manager of a football club comes around and says, you know what, we know what you're going through, this is what we're going to do about it. That would be unheard of now in this capitalist kind of football world we live in now. Yeah, at that time, Celtic was really at the forefront of understanding the supporters' feelings and trying to do as much as they could about it.
And was that just really Celtic that would do that, or was that the common pattern throughout the rest of the clubs?
Well, I think Celtic, as normal, were first. I think other clubs, I think it was very shrewd of Celtic to kind of lower prices, because such the support that Celtic had, we could, carry that. Other clubs would find it hard then to charge our supporters more, which, we didn't seem to have a problem with it right now, obviously, but back then, it was kind of hard. But see, this was always a Celtic way, where it was like, at one point you had Willie Mealy saying, we've got to go and help supporters, we've got to lower prices. And as he was doing that, Tom White, the chairman, was saying to the players, you're getting paid too much money. So we were always trying to save money, The biscuit tin was very much alive at that point as well. But certainly Celtic, I think, were at the forefront of that. Primarily, I think, because of why we were formed. We never really, although we became a privately made company, pretty much no long after we were formed and stuff, we never really lost a sense of who it was that actually supported us, and who was responsible for the growth of Celtic. Because, as we mentioned in previous podcasts, other Celtic teams fell by the wayside, and it was really hard for Celtic. And what kept it going was the people. The people kept Celtic going. And thankfully, Celtic never forgot that in that time. And I think the supporters never forgot either the fact that Celtic never forgot it and repaid it with such immense faithfulness in the club.
It's funny you should say about the biscuit tin approach. I don't want to keep harping back to Jimmy McGrory, but when he turned down that offer to go to play for Arsenal, he never got the same wages as the rest of the players till his career ended at Celtic. Yeah, absolutely incredible. I mean, here was a guy who could have set himself up for life by going to Arsenal in 1928 and turned round to Chairman Tom White and said, no, I want to play for Celtic. I thought his quote at the time was fantastic. Now, I don't know if this is just the realms of fantasy or the folklore that's grown up around Jimmy McGrory. But for him to turn around and say the reason he didn't go to Arsenal was because McGrory of Arsenal didn't sound as good as McGrory of Celtic. Yeah. And I mean, that's just, it is. I mean, I've heard that quote on numerous occasions as well. And these are the reasons why you support Celtic when you hear stuff like that, because he was a guy, he wasn't just at the forefront of Scottish football or British football or European football. He's at the forefront of world football, and he was Celtic through and through. He loved the club. He remained at the club after being a player. He went on to become the manager, and he had held many positions at the club right up until he died in 1982. And I remember actually reading The Glory and the Dream by Tom Campbell and Pat Woods, which is a fantastic book. And Tom Campbell was talking about when he's a teacher in Ontario in Canada, and he's at a parents' night and people queuing up to see him. And he had spotted this one guy who he knew came to Scotland originally, and he was looking forward to seeing him because his daughter had done really well and he couldn't wait to tell him. And the guy sat down and he said, have you heard? And Tom said, what? He said, Jimmy McGrory died today. And he said, he just sat and talked for an hour about Jimmy McGrory. And, he said it was brilliant because Tom said, I laughed, I cried and all that kind of thing. And then the person goes away and the wife says to the guy, well, how did she get on then? He's like, oh, Christ, aye. And I have to go back and ask again, I mean, that was the kind of impact that McGrory had on the Celtic people, and I think it's probably the only unfortunate thing about McGrory is we didn't have enough footage and enough people alive that saw him to give him the recognition, which would be, without question, in my opinion, the greatest player that ever played for Celtic. And even when you think back to more recent years and I think Larson is probably one of the obvious characters of our more modern history, Paul. You know, when he had the opportunities to leave and stayed, and, you know, the goals that Henrik Larsson scored for Celtic, you know, Larsson's probably, I'll probably get lambasted for this, but he's probably one of the guys very close to the same sort of character as Jimmy McGrory. You know, he had opportunities to leave, but he just liked playing there, and he scored an awful lot of goals for Celtic. But for a foreigner to come and get it,
I mean, the analogy with Larsson is good for the modern day fan. I mean, of course, they both had the same middle name, which was Edward, which was pretty incredible. But if people want to look at the impact of Jimmy McGrory, what I would say is, if you look at the impact that Henrik Larsson had over 7 years, and then just imagine he stayed for another 7 years and had the same impact, that's the kind of impact that McGrory had on Celtic. You know, I mean, that's the length of time that he was there. And then, of course, I mean, McGrory, I mean, it's incredible to think that even if he had just scored these 550 goals for Celtic, you'd think, well, that's as much. But he was a manager of the team that won the Coronation Cup.
That's right.
He was a manager of the 7-1 team. I mean, this is, you know, you can't really get a much of a bigger impact. I mean, he's in, you know, when you talk about Jokestein and all that kind of thing, and, you know, Brother Wilfred, Jimmy McGrory's on that level. No question about it.
Well, do you think, I think McGrory was the only pre-war Celtic player that was named in the greatest Celtic team ever?
Yeah, I mean, it just his impact on it. But I mean, I say he was the top scorer in Europe twice in his career. When FIFA had their anniversary, he was the third player mentioned after Pelé and Puskas when they talked about the great players of world football. I mean, you can never underestimate it. And the fact that, I mean, the stories are amazing. You know, the Patsy Gallagher always told the story about telling a young winger where all you've got to do is kick the ball in the box and aim it at that guy's head. And he was like, "Oh, who's that?" He said, "Oh, it's Jimmy McGrory." He said, "Oh, it's good." He said, "But remember, son, he wants the laces turned away from his forehead." You know? I mean, it's just the kind of things, and people. And I think, I think that Scottish people and Irish people, especially, we love to romanticise stuff. You know, we love a tragedy and all that kind of thing, and all that. But when they were watching McGrory at that time, they didn't know the impact he was going to have or anything like that. And you read some of the match reports, they're absolutely incredible. You know, his ability to head a ball for 18 yards harder than people could kick it. I mean, to this day, I can hardly even get my head around that. Never mind, you know, it's just like, how are you able to do that? Because if you look at McGrory, he had virtually no neck whatsoever. So there was no real kind of way to pull his head back, but he was broad-shouldered, and he had the heart of a lion, and he went for these goals at a time when goals were hard to come by.
And he was 5'6".
Exactly. And yet people say the best header of a ball that ever played for Celtic, a guy at 5'6".
Fantastic.
You know, so phenomenal.
We seek him here, we seek him there, never to find is very rare. You can go to any single country in the world and you'll find dedicated followers.
My favourite part of Celtic Park, it's changed over the years. I've been going to Celtic Park regular since about 82, 83. But I went to the odd game in the 70s. My dad would take me to the odd game, but I wasn't a regular attender until I sort of started high school and started going like every week. So it was always, when I went with my dad years ago, it was always the main stand or the old traditional Rangers end. And you get then, when I started going on the supporters bus for Wishaw myself, we'd always get a lift over, so it'd be the Rangers end then, because it'd be easier to get a lift over there. We'd always get some older guys in the bus, or just stand outside the turnstiles and just ask to get a lift over. So I went for the Rangers end, then graduated into the jungle, then up the back of the jungle, or the singing section, things like that. That was great. And then as you get a wee bit older, maybe went into the Celtic end, sometimes the main stand. The Rangers end, that was brilliant in there when we played teams like Aberdeen in that in the early 80s, before they had the big fences up and stuff like that. They put these wee temporary fences up, and it was like running battles between Celtic and Aberdeen supporters and Hearts. Hearts used to get the full Rangers end. And then getting back to the days in the 80s, always filled me with fond memories. Celtic Park rocking against Dundee United, rocking against Aberdeen and against Hearts to a certain extent, and Rangers were a sort of non-event during the 80s.
1967 is the year we all love best, 'cause we are dedicated followers of Celtic, the greatest team.
When I was a child, coming to Lanarkshire, my dad always went to what we call the Rangers End. I don't know if you can remember them, but their supporters used to go in there. Basically, our buses parked behind there, where the old Bar's Ginger Works used to be, and it was a quick donor up all the many stairs when I was a child, after getting lifted out, of course. And when I got into the Rangers End, I always wanted to be somewhere else, because just over diagonally opposite me, halfway down the middle of the jungle, and I think when you're a kid, no matter where you are on the ground, at that time, when I started going for about 67, 68, all the kids wanted to be in the jungle, but clearly I was only a wee boy and my dad wasn't up for that at all. I'd have my naughty answer. It's quite formidable in itself. But of course, when I became a teenager and all that, there's no holding me, and the jungle was my place.
Yes, you'll find dedicated followers of Celtic. Yeah, you'll find dedicated followers of Celtic.
So even in that period, Paul, and the team was quite successful, and the Scottish Cup, even the mid-90s for Celtic fans, there was a special buzz about the Scottish Cup. And we heard in Chapter 2, when I was talking to Harry, about how the Scottish Cup really was the prominent trophy to win for the longest time when the football started to be introduced. But Celtic, even during this period of the 20s, enjoyed some fantastic cup finals.
Yes. I mean, there was the Scottish Cup. People in the generation probably above us always used to say, that was Celtic's trophy, And Celtic was always widely regarded the best cup team in Scotland. And it was around about this era that really came to prominence. I mean, the first cup win was in 1923 against Hibs. And it was a 1-0 win. Cassidy scored the winner. And by all intents and purposes, people said they were at the game, and the reports on that said it was an awful game. A truly awful game. Except the one kind of anomaly, the one thing that we stood out was the fact that, of course, the Celtic manager at the time was Willie Mealy, but the Hibs manager at the time was actually his brother Alec Mealy, which is just incredible. When you talk about impacts of families on different things, I mean, the impact the Mealy family had on football was incredible. Another huge crowd. It was 87,000 people turned up at that game. Incredible crowd. And then, of course, in 1925, we had the famous Patsy Gallagher Cup final, which, again, romanticising stuff like that, but the reports at the time, Dundee had went 1-0 up, had been playing reasonably well, it was a decent Dundee team. And then, second half, Patsy picked up the ball inside his own half, and as the commentators would describe it, he jinked and weaved his way through 6 Dundee players. And what actually happened was, as he got towards the goalkeeper, he was about to try and turn him, where this guy came in full-blooded at him, hit him with a 2-footed tackle, actually turned him round so he had his back to goal, and that was the point where Patsy somersaulted into the net. So it wasn't even as people, but he didn't just kind of do a forward roll, he actually managed to backflip into the net. So much power in it that not only did the ball end up at the back of the net, but Patsy ended up in the back of the net. And it took him about 5 minutes to get Patsy out the net because he was so entangled in it. And people that were there and commentators that were there just had never, could not believe what they had seen. They just could not believe that this audacious skill. And it was, if you look at world football books and history books, the Patsy Gallagher goal in 1925 is regarded as the greatest Scottish Cup goal ever, and possibly the greatest goal ever in a cup final. It certainly was described as that at the time. This was a moment, as we talked about Celtic being in decline, but I tell you, in 1925 when we won that cup, that goal inspired us so much. The fans were so enriched by that very just moment of genius that we actually went on to win the league again in 1926. And people said that it was that day, it was that goal that Patsy scored that they made them believe that anything was possible, that this club could produce anything. And what's interesting, and a wee contrast to that, of course, is that in 1927, there was a game against East Fife in the cup final. East Fife were a second division team at the time. And, Celtic were widely expected to thrash them, no problem, and all that kind of thing. But East Fife took the lead, and, there were people basically saying that, fans on the terrace couldn't even look at each other because they could not believe that Celtic had went a goal down to East Fife. That this was actually happening. But Celtic thankfully came back, we scored 3 goals in quick succession. And so 3-1 up in the second half. The players had decided at half time that what we're going to do here is we're going to have some fun, we're going to entertain the crowd. And so what the game was is that the players were just going to set up Tommy McNally all the time. And Tommy McNally was to shoot for anywhere, shot for inside his own half, and he was shooting for anywhere. And it got to the point where East Fife were so demoralised by this that Tommy McNally twice ran through, rounded the keeper, and deliberately missed.
I look at Harold Bratback in a whole different way now because I saw him run round the goalkeeper a few times and miss and laugh his ass off.
But that was, again, like we talked about the characters and the entertainers and all that kind of thing. Any opportunity to go people like Tommy McNally and Patsy Gallagher to entertain, they would take it, Sorry, they saw themselves as, as that's what their duty was to the support.
An interesting little tidbit about that 1927 Cup final is that it was the first ever Cup final broadcast live on radio.
Yes, that's right.
So you have to think about the times where radio had really just started to take off. And one of the funny things that I noticed whenever I was doing a wee bit of research for tonight was I was looking at how media started to get introduced into football and when the big events and stuff were, and I found a piece of Pathé News, and it was a Celtic Rangers Cup final from sometime in the 30s anyway, and Celtic Rangers game. It looked like Hampden, and 2 things that struck me about it was, first of all, of course, the size of the crowd, which we've already talked about, but the other thing that's actually surprised me was the standard of the football was very, very good. I know an awful lot of us get romantic about, this fantastic idea, this brilliant team, but still when you think back to football matches in this era, you're still thinking it's kick and rush, my God, with 5 forwards, and most of me just humping the ball up the pitch. And the little bit that I saw, which probably was about 4 or 5 minutes, wasn't the case. Like, people actually did pass the ball.
Yeah. I think you're absolutely right. I think, if you were to speak to somebody like the Lisbon Lions or whatever and say, oh God, it was much easier to score goals in your day and do things in your day, they'd probably, just laugh at you because they were getting kicked and pushed and punched and no. I think what has changed over the period of football is defensively. Defensively, things have changed. The defences have got better. They've got more organised. I think it was the actual 1930s Arsenal team was one of the first teams that played a kind of flat back 4 under Herbert Chapman and stuff like that. And that's what changed, because before, as you say, 5 forwards and all that kind of thing. Even if it wasn't lying, I had 4 forwards up in the European Cup final. So that's what changed. But, clearly, what you have to understand, that people have to understand about that time, is that it was just as hard, if not harder, to score goals because defenders and goalkeepers could get away with a lot more.
That's right. That's right.
So, they weren't getting pulled up for anything. And you look at the Leeds United team of the 70s who won trophies on the basis of kicking people off the ball continuously, doing stuff over the ball. You can imagine that was in an era when there was TV cameras. Imagine what it was like when there wasn't any TV cameras.
Could you imagine?
I've heard, doing a bit of research for this, I heard Jimmy Delaney talk about the fact that he'd never actually been to Celtic Park before he actually signed for Celtic, because he came from Cleland and he was a wee toon guy. He wasn't a big city guy and all that kind of thing. But his father did. And he said when his father used to come back to the games and he used to tell young Jimmy about them, he said, I used to think he was going to watch a war every week. He said, because they were just, these brave men going out there and all that kind of thing. And I suppose the only thing that offset that at the time, Chris, is the fact that you could basically assault the goalkeeper to score a goal.
I think they should bring that rule back, actually.
Very well protected. I tell you, I wish I'd been brought to bring it back for the Seville game in 2003. That would have been nice just for that one off. But no, you've seen it on these Pathé Newsies where it sounds like Mr. Chumley Warner's commentating and all that kind of thing, where you see goalkeepers getting bundled into the net all the time. and the bravery was just incredible. Because these guys, most of them were wearing woolly jumpers.
That's right, yeah.
They've no gloves, and they've no padded shorts or anything like that. But they would go out for £6 a week and give their all for the team,
And that brings us nicely on to one of the other fabulous characters that we haven't talked about yet, and that is, of course, Johnny Thompson.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, the next podcast I'll touch on what actually happened to him. But again, looking at the match reports, we talked about tragedies before. I mean, there's a horrific tragedy, so it's easy to romanticise John Thompson and that kind of thing. But one report I read was that John Thompson was actually able to turn in midair and save a shot. So he's diving one way, the ball gets deflected another way, and he twists in midair and manages to save it against Queen's Park. And the Queen's Park defender, a guy called Tom Snedden, I think, said he'd never seen anything like it on a football pitch. And he said that he went over at the next corner and he was about to congratulate him when John Thompson stood on his toe. So
I love all that stuff. I can listen to all that stuff all day long.
It's brilliant. For such a young boy, to come out to Fife and play. Because another thing as well, Chris, is that you talk about, like what Jimmy Delaney said as well, we're talking about the strife that we were in Glasgow, the sectarianism, the violence and that kind of thing. Can you imagine what that was like for a young boy from Fife to come up to Glasgow and play for Celtic? It was a scary prospect, And Willie had a kind of habit of just, scouting guys and bring them in and then say, right, I'll meet us at this place at this time, and then they pick them up on a bus and they take them to a place and they'd be saying, well, where the hell are we? So we're out for a part, you're playing it right half of the day. And that would be it. Because he knew, how, if he'd say to somebody, listen, you're going to be playing on Saturday, he said half the boys wouldn't even turn up. Because they were so scared, you know what I mean? This big city, it was like, they were coming to a wee village in Fife, it was just, the scariest place on earth. So, for John Thompson to go out and produce the kind of form that he did, he was nicknamed the Prince of Goalkeepers even then, was nothing short of phenomenon. For such a young boy to come to a background like that, to come and play for Celtic in front of huge crowds and perform at that level was just nothing short of amazing.
Because the classic quote, Paul, is Johnny Thompson talking to Jimmy McGrory, and Johnny Thompson turns around and says to him, hey Jimmy, I'm being called a Fenian bastard out there by one of the opposing players. And of course, John Thompson was non-Catholic, and Jimmy McGrory turns around to him and says, John, don't worry about that, I get that in every game I play. And John Thompson turns around and says, I know, that's all right, because you are one.
I know, it's it kind of, I mean, it's again, I think it's quite illuminating in the fact that when that was going on, this is we talked about how Rangers were kind of putting their identity into their club. But there was never anything like that at Celtic. That Celtic was never as Willie Maley once said. Celtic Park, where a man's judged on his football alone, and that was very much the kind of thing that went on all the time. It was just that people's religion wasn't an issue. It just was not an issue at a time when in society your religion was a massive issue.
From 1920 to 1930, there were very little changes to the Celtic home shirt. The hoops were worn throughout this decade along with the ever-present white shorts. The only slight changes to the home kit was subtle differences added to the socks. During this decade, the away kit was changed a number of times. 1921 to 1922, our away kit was a green shirt with a white collar. This was worn with white shorts and black socks with 2 green hoops at the top of each sock. In 1922 and 1923, our away kit was a green shirt with a white collar, but this time the shirt had a thick, solitary white hoop in the middle of it. This was worn with white socks and black shorts with 2 green hoops at the top of each sock. In 1923 to 1924, our away kit was an all-green shirt, which was worn with white shorts and black socks, with 2 green hoops and a white hoop sandwiched in between the green hoops at the top of each sock. In 1924 to 1925, our away kit again was an all-green shirt, which was worn with white shorts, but this time the socks only had the 2 green hoops at the top of each sock. For the 1925-1926 season, Celtic chose a massive change in their away kit, as an all-white shirt was introduced with a shamrock adoring the left breast. This was worn with black shorts, and again with the black socks with the 2 green hoops at the top of each sock. Season 1926-1927 saw another big change in the away kit, as not only radical new design was introduced, but with 2 away kits. The new shirt design was made up of alternative green and white quarters, which was worn with white shorts and again with black socks, with the 2 green hoops at the top of each sock. The second away kit was a dark green shirt, which was worn with white shorts and the usual black socks with 2 green hoops. Season 1927 to 1928 saw Celtic revert to 1 away kit, and this was a lighter green shirt, which was again worn with the white socks and the usual black socks with 2 green hoops. In 1928 to 1929, our away kit was an all green shirt with a white collar, worn with black shorts, and once again the black socks with 2 green hoops. In 1929 to 1930, our away kit was an all-white shirt with black shorts, and again the black socks with the 2 green hoops on top.
And again, it harps back, and we've touched on it up till now, you know, how Celtic were the working man's club at the time, or maybe the unemployed man's club as they were at the time. Yet the whole structure of Rangers at that time was, as you say, just the antithesis of everything that Celtic was.
Yeah, I mean, as I said before, I mean, there was a clear remit that went right through the club that was to attract the Scottish Protestant middle class, the Ibrox. That was what they were trying to do. And how it ended up being the Scottish Protestant underclass, I'll never know, but that's another story. But definitely, there was definitely, I mean, this whole thing, Chris, it still goes on to this day. We always laugh about the brown brogues and the dignified Rangers tie and all that nonsense. I mean, that all comes from Struth. And, you know, this perception that they kind of have, and that probably ended up killing them, they would always trust somebody as long as they were in a suit. You know, it was just like, you know, was all born in that era where this kind of, you know, if Celtic are appealing to the kind of the Irish working class and the Scottish working class people in Glasgow, then we'll go for something else, you know.
Mm-hmm. It's funny, again, we keep bringing up modern history and experiences that we've all had, you know, all the people that have joined in with the podcast, and it comes up again and again and again. I remember, you know, the experience that I had growing up in Belfast in the 90s, and the terrible, terrible 90s. And Tommy Burns came over to West Belfast to do a question and answer session. And Paul, he was getting pelters. Absolute pelters. How are we going to stop Rangers doing 9-0? And Tommy Burns took this for about an hour and a half, and you can just imagine this. This will paint a beautiful picture in your mind if you remember Tommy Burns. And he stood there looking like a priest, as he always did, you know. And he had his hand up against his chin, and he answered as best he could. But you could see his face getting redder and redder and redder. And guys were giving it to him large. They were giving it big licks about, you know, how bad the club was and all this here kind of stuff. And Tommy stopped one particularly vocal gentleman, and he says, okay. He says, look, I'm going to ask everybody in the room one question, and one question only. Would you rather be one of them, or would you rather be one of us? Just in that little calm manner. And there was a split second of complete silence, and the huge cheer that went up then, you know, and everyone, you know, the whole place nearly fell down, Paul. And see, after that, the questions were, who was the best player you played with, Tommy?
No, you're right. I mean, that is, you know, it's... Robert Kelly was the guy who coined the phrase, you know, we're more than a football club, and I believe that's going to be on the new strips and stuff like that. And I think it should have been recognised, because when you actually expand what Robert Kelly said, was that Robert Kelly spoke about how it was a way of life for people, that Celtic was the beacon of light in people's lives and all that kind of thing. And that's what we always should be. We always should be that. It's never just been about winning trophies. Because if it was just about winning trophies, people in the East End of Glasgow would not have been fed. You know? The mortality was huge. It would have been a lot more if Celtic had just been about winning trophies. It would always been this the people's club, and that's the way it should be, Chris, you know what I mean? And that's what got us through the dark times when you talk about the 90s, and it got us through many of the dark periods in the 20s as well. The fact that there was always the romanticism there was always that wee bit of magic there, and that the people understood that Celtic were the embodiment of everything that they believed in their life. And Celtic were able to carry that torch brilliantly, you know, right through their entire history, you know, right up until, you know, this season and last season and so on and so on. And that's something that, you know, you can never underestimate that. No trophy will ever be able to replace that either.
And that's really what sets the club apart. You know, every Celtic supporter you talk to, every single one has a story to tell about whether it was where you lived, you know, where you had to keep your Celtic shirt zipped up underneath your coat, right down to the criminalisation we have today. You know, throughout the whole history, 125 years, it has been the fans that have been this club, and it's wonderful to be able to tell the history of Celtic from a fan's perspective, without all the glossed over romanticisms and some things that were conveniently forgotten in some of the more official channels where the story of the club get told. But to sit down over 10 podcasts and talk to Celtic fans where we look back at the social aspect of the club at the time, and still you have this team that attracts like a moth to a flame.
Yeah, I mean, I think I was actually talking to a non-Celtic supporter 2 nights ago, and we were talking about Celtic in the Champions League and our prospects this coming season of being in it or not being in it and stuff like that. And I said, as long as we get in it, we'll have an impact. And he went, how you know you're going to sign on that? I said, look at our home record in the Champions League. Phenomenal. Different players, different managers. What's the one consistent? The support.
That's right.
The support is what's made that Champions League record. The support is what's made Celtic Park the mecca of football, you know, and they'll never change it. I mean, right back to you talk about years ago. You talk about like the things like the Coronation Cup song, you know, because that's what the guy says. They end up saying, you know, to beat Glasgow Celtic, you'll have to deport the whole Fenian Irish to give them support, and there's a lot of truth in that, you know. There's a lot of truth in that, because that's what it is about Celtic. It is the support. It's the, you know, and I know it infuriates the fans, the other clubs, and all that kind of thing. I think we go on about it all the time and all that kind of thing, you know. And I always remember Ian Ferguson when he had his testimonial, and he had a slagging off of Celtic on his T-shirt that had the greatest fans in the world.com, which is meant to be slagging us. Right. I wonder how he felt when UEFA and FIFA gave us that exact award, you know. Because this is what it's all about for the Celtic support. Because, you know, if I meet you or anybody else after a game and it's a crap game, oh, that was rubbish and blah, 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 I'll guarantee you within 15 minutes we're laughing and joking. That's what it's all about. Because, you know, Christ, if it was about football results, we'd all support Barcelona, you know, or Real Madrid or something. It's about Celtic being that identity for us, that Celtic Park being our cathedral or Mecca, and we respond by giving it the best atmosphere on the planet when the top teams come to Celtic Park.
Paul, you touched on one thing that I wanted to ask you about there, actually. And in this decade as well, this is where fans maybe started to sing songs at games.
The songs that were routinely sung on the terraces by Celtic supporters were things like Hail Glory St Patrick, God Save Ireland, Slave the Man, the Soldier Song, obviously, and Erin's Green Valleys, you know. And so clearly, you know, the identity was very still clear in the mind of the supporters there. And obviously, a lot of the songs, you know, were getting sung about things that, you know, you think about like God Save Ireland and stuff about the Manchester Martyrs and that. You know, they weren't that far away, you know, for these events as we are now, you know. But I love the kind of image of the Celtic supporters singing "Slave the Man" on the terrace, because it's such a beautiful song, you know. And you know, these are you know, the way the Green Brigade are able to pick up these songs. I'd love to see them being able to pick up some of these songs again, because they're absolutely fantastic, and there are songs that only bigots could have problems with. So why bother? Think of anybody that might be offended or not.
Well, I'll tell you a funny story. The only time I've ever heard my father singing is every 17th of March in Mass, and he sings Hail Glory St Patrick. You know, some of us damn Catholics, we don't sing in Mass.
Oh, Christ, I know. Aye. It's like if you're not a Mass goer and you go back for a while, you're sitting and going, what's the word again? And everybody's singing along merrily,
Hail Gloria St. Patrick. What a brilliant way to end the podcast. Right.
Well, I'd just like to end it with this, Chris, this is a description that a commentator gave after watching a Celtic Rangers game in the 1920s. He said, "It was a struggle between the virtues, the improvisation and inspiration of Celtic, and the organisation and method of Rangers." And I think that sums up perfectly the difference between Celtic and Rangers.
Was that written in the 1920s, or was that written last week?
Yeah, it could have been. It certainly wouldn't have been done by Archie McPherson, that's for sure.
Paul, absolutely fantastic to talk to you tonight. And before you go, I want you to nominate a charity that any of the proceeds from the podcast will go to support.
The charity I want to nominate, Chris, is the Ashling Irish Centre, which is on McLean Avenue in the Bronx, and it is an organisation, totally non-profit, totally voluntary, that helps new immigrants settle in the country. And that's where I'd like my part of the charity to go.
The hairs in the back of my neck just rose there a little bit, because if that isn't what Celtic's all about, I don't know what is.
Yes, exactly.
Fantastic. Give us that again, Paul. What is the name of the charity again? Repeat it for
me. The Ashling Irish Centre, which is on McLean Avenue in the Bronx. And there's a wee personal reason, if you didn't mind, Chris. I'll tell you why exactly. Anybody who goes to the Bronx or in New York will tell you that these people will help you, they advise you how to get a house and a job and all that kind of thing. But what they also did for us is, when I went back a second occasion, they actually were able to get my son free health insurance, which was a big thing in itself, except 6 months later, he really needed that health insurance because he contracted lead poisoning.
My goodness.
So without that free health insurance, he might never have been treated, because we might never have been able to afford the medical costs in New York that would have cost to get him treated. So this is my way kind of saying thank you to them. It's the Ashling Irish Centre, McLean Avenue in the Bronx. Wonderful people, and if you're ever going over to the Bronx, that's the people who will help you.
Real heroes.
Absolutely.
Fantastic. Paul, as ever, wonderful to chat with you.
And you, sir.
And I will talk to you again very, very soon.
Perfect. Thanks very much, Chris. Cheers.
Brilliant, Paul. So there's our folks, that's the end of chapter 3. Absolutely brilliant again, and wonderful to catch up with Paul Larkin as usual. Of course, this episode wouldn't be possible without the help of loads and loads of different people. So in no particular order, thanks a million to Pat from Half the World Away podcast, The Human Torpedo, Richard from Carluke, Jim Blythe, Gary from Bristol, Tommy Donnelly, Chris Kuyava, Stuart from the CelticShirt.co.uk, Kelly from Stonehouse, Jason Higgins, everybody that left the voicemails and all the little audio clips, and Charlie and the boys, and the Wakes, of course, for the music. So make sure you check out the Ashling Irish Centre in Queens, which is a charity that Paul will have his portion of all the money raised through the donations for these podcasts donated to. And their web address, if you want to have a little look around, is ashlingcenter.org. That's AISLINGCENTER.org. And a fantastic worthy cause it is too. Now, we're still getting loads of downloads, and we're still getting some donations. I think that's the most politically correct way to put it. We have broken 250 quid so far. That's not bad after 2 podcasts. And we're hoping to break at least 1,000 quid, because you couldn't hold a charity anything less than £100 each. And we will have 10 charities, of course. So make your way to healhealmedia.com and donate 50p, £1, £5. If you want to pay for the whole series, donate a tenner, and then your conscience is clear. But we really would like to see a few more funds coming in. And remember, every single penny that is raised through this series will go directly to the charities. No wages, no costs, nothing like that. And every one of the 10 charities that will benefit from this are absolutely worthy and very close to all our hearts. So get your money in the words of Bob Geldof, get your money in now. And you can do that by going to healhealmedia.com and look for the donate button on the Celtic History Podcast page. Couldn't be easier. Remember, you can also still send in your sound bites for inclusion in the fan section of the podcast. Record them on your iPhone, record them on your Android, record them at your computer, dead simple, and then send them to lostboys@gmail.com. And if you don't do it, you're going to miss out, because this is our history podcast and you should really be part of it. Just do 30 seconds about a funny story whenever you were following Celtic, you know, where you were whenever the Rebels won, who your favourite player is and why, what your daddy told you about Celtic, why you're a Celtic supporter. All that sort of stuff is absolutely brilliant and really does make the podcast what it is. Because if we don't have the fans, we don't have anything. I was just busting to say that. So next week I will have Tom Minogue from the Celtic Wiki covering 1930 to 1940. What the hell happened between 1930 and 1940? Well, of course, we toured America and Canada. We have the whole John Thompson story, the Empire Exhibition Cup, and our 50th anniversary. So you think there's not much goes on in the decade? Start reading your history and you'll realise that there's tons to talk about. My name's Chris McGuigan. Hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. Talk to you all next week. And one more time for luck, go to heelheelmedia.com and make a wee donation, 50p, £1, £5. Just follow the link to the Celtic History Podcast and let's make a big difference.
My biggest disappointment would have to be the League Cup final at Ibrox against Wraith Rovers, where we failed to see the game out in the last 6 minutes, was it, when Charlie Nicholas scored, only for Gordon DL to equalise a couple of minutes later, take the game into extra time, and sadly beaten penalties. And to crown it, one of the all-time heroes, Paul McStay, missed the penalty. However, couldn't blame him for anything. I could forgive Paul McStay for anything. He was one of the best ever players to play for the Hibs.
Was my gran told me in the early 60s, when she was a young girl in 1918, 1917, around about that time, time of the First World War. She lived in the Gallagher and did all her life beside Jimmy McGrory, and she actually used to count for him the number of headers, heading the ball off the wall in a close, and apparently it went to 1,000. She used to tell me this. She used to count Jimmy McGrory heading the ball 1,000 times back and forth up a close in the Gallagher. So that's one of my earliest ever memories, is a memory of my gran.
My favourite moment's got to be Seville. When I got there, it was it must have been easy 80 degrees. It was a nice place. It was just filling up with Celtic fans. It was 2 days before the match. The next day was a few more fans there, starting to get busy. And the actual day of the match, I don't think I've ever seen as many Celtic fans all in one place. And I always remember looking at the policeman who was trying to guide the traffic through the main street. And he just looked over at the other policeman and waved his hands as if to say, "That's it. Shut the street down. There's just no way we're going to keep people on the pavement." It was a fantastic moment. And apart from the score, it's probably one of my greatest trips ever in my life, going to see Celtic. I'll never forget Henrik Larsson's header to take it all square. It was a fantastic moment. Fantastic.
Sing me a song of Patsy Gallagher, one of the Celtic boys. When he gets a ball, he dribbles through the mall, and it's a sure goal. Jimmy McManamy, Andy McIntyre, they are the real boys. But the best wee team in Bonnie, Scotland, is the team that wears the green and white.